Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and joining us. Um, Thank you so much to our presenters, Davy Knittle, Rina Garcia Chua, Daniel Rivers, and Rebecca O. Unfortunately, Heidi Hong is not going to be able to join us today. She's quite sick. But her materials are still in the folder on Google Drive, which hopefully you were all able to access. And what I'm hoping is that, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the kitten meowing in the background, but she's fine. She's just telling me she wants my attention. Anyway, Heidi's materials are in the folder, but I'm hoping that in the Q&A we'll get a chance to hear from all the other presenters about the cover letter, since we won't hear directly from Heidi about that. Let's see, what else do I want to mention? I want to let you know that we're going to end right at the 90-minute mark really promptly to respect all of your time. I'm going to go into a land acknowledgement activity in a moment. That's going to take 2 to 3 minutes. But first, I wanted to just let you know that we are going to have a third professional development workshop, most likely in October. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but based on the poll that we did in the first professional development workshop this past May, folks told us that they wanted to hear about alternate academic jobs, like academic adjacent jobs. Just what are other people who have PhDs in the environmental humanities doing with their degree? So we already have a few people in mind. We're really excited about that conversation. So just watch for that on the grad student Facebook page. So moving into the land acknowledgement activity, I'm Lisa Fink. I'm the senior graduate student liaison for ASLE, and I'm joining today from what has come to be called Portland, Oregon. I want to affirm that these are the rightful homelands of the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Tenino, Wasco, Wishram, Paiute, and many other Native people who will live here and have always lived here. They have always belonged to and cared for this land and water, and whose bold resistance to colonial oppression should guide us all. I invite everyone to offer your own land and water recognition in the chat, but I want to take a few minutes to invite you into a practice. And if you joined us for the May workshop, perhaps you have your notebook where you wrote your reflection then, and I invite you to look back at that and see what you wrote and add to it. But for others, I'm going to share my screen with this activity. This practice was inspired by an organization called the Bark Defenders of Mount Hood. They often in their events lead a reflective acknowledgement practice. And the aim here is to guide non-Indigenous participants toward developing a personal connection and personal goals for the work of supporting Indigenous sovereignty. And you're welcome to turn off your video as we practice this, because we're going to do some writing. So I want you to get something to write with, pen, pencil, computer, and take the next 2 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, next steps for yourself, outlining how you're going to develop your practice of acknowledgement through action. What actions are you prepared to take to honor the original people here today across the US and around the globe, past, present, and future? And if you've set intentions in the past, we invite you to reflect on those past efforts and update your intentions and action plan. we're going to let the video keep going so that people who watch this video later can also engage in this practice. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. And now is the time for some reflection. So it's been about 2 minutes. I'm going to invite you to start to wrap up your writing and to start moving your thinking away from yourself, and take perhaps another minute to give yourself the space to practice humility, practice gratitude, the things that have come up for you while you were writing, and direct that outside of yourself toward the communities most impacted by colonization, the theft of land, and the genocide of cultures. And as folks begin to come back with cameras back on, hopefully there's a different energy present in the room. And I would like to welcome anyone from any Indigenous communities to take the space if you would like to, if it suits you right now, to add any thoughts or comments. You're welcome to do that in the chat. You're welcome to just speak up in this moment if you like. If you want to take up space during any time in this workshop, let us know. You can signal me in the chat, in a private message. You can just speak up, and I'm here to be a support to hold that space. I want to note that this practice does focus on non-Indigenous people in our learning, and that is burdensome in a lot of ways. And I hope you'll use me as a resource so this space can serve everyone. So thank you for engaging in that practice with me. I hope it has warmed us all up and grounded us for the workshop today. As I mentioned at the start of the workshop, Heidi Amenhong will not be able to join us. She is sick. So we're going to hopefully talk about the cover letter in the Q&A, but I'm going to allow each of the presenters to introduce themselves as they like. And, but I'll just briefly say, the order that we're going to go in so that our participants here can kind of track that. So we're going to start with Rebecca, who will talk about the research statement. Daniel will discuss the teaching statement and portfolio. Rina will discuss postdoc statements, the leadership statement and research contribution statement. Davy, the diversity statement, and Cassie will round us out with a discussion of materials for community college jobs. All of these documents that they're going to be talking about are available in the Drive folder that I shared with you, the Google Drive folder. So you can look at them there. Some of our presenters are going to share their screen, so we'll be able to look at them all on the screen together. If you are, if you didn't get that link or to the Google Drive, or you're having problems accessing it, let me know. I'm going to put my email in the chat so you can contact me about that. And as I do that, I'm going to invite Rebecca to start us off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lisa, for leading us in that activity. I've actually never done anything like that. Usually it's just sort of like the land acknowledgement and not this kind of reflective time. But but yeah, so let's, I guess I'm just going to jump into things. So I'm talking about the research statement. I guess I'll try to say like just a line about the cover letter because it's sort of in relation to the research statement. So the cover letter is usually this kind of flashy document. It's like a sort of look at me document, right? Where you want to lay out your expertise and your kind of biggest kind of punches with like the innovation and the arguments for your project. You're inviting people to kind of want to read the rest of your application. And so kind of in contrast to that, the research statement is a little bit more of a slower introduction to your work. So the research statement really situates you within your kind of larger intellectual trajectory, right? So the cover letter is usually responding to the particular call, really kind of tailoring the project to the position that they're asking for. And the research statement really kind of is a place for you to indicate your more general kind of research interests, the kinds of questions you like to ask, your sort of arenas of concern. So the statement kind of is like, this is where I am now, and this is where I could logically be in the next 5 to 7 years. It kind of is a guide for the committee to kind of have a kind of trajectory of your kind of sense of yourself as a scholar, and not just kind of your one moment like now at the end of grad school. So in terms of, so the research statement does a couple of things. It does give more information about your current project. So, if you're introducing it in the cover letter, you have more space in your research statement to kind of unpack more of your project in detail. You can do a lot of different things in terms of what you choose to sort of highlight in the project, in the research statement. It could be another opportunity to draw attention to things you want to highlight or reiterate the real core of the project. And just because they read the cover letter doesn't mean that they sort of remember everything. But so you can do a lot of things here. You can draw some attention to the project's more complex layers. You can unpack your methodology or your historical trajectory, or maybe discuss an extended example. But the real kind of point of doing any of those things is to show how the kind of research project derives from or descends from the kind of larger intellectual questions that you kind of open the statement with, right? Like I'm a scholar who is interested in aesthetics and politics, and then you're kind of unpacking what that looks like vis-a-vis your dissertation, for example. So again, if the cover letter is about sort of like drawing them in, the research statement kind of continues to introduce them to the project, but also really shows off the sort of larger research themes that you say you're interested in, and kind of illustrates how your dissertation is kind of situated within those interests or a manifestation of them. You can also kind of talk about the sort of immediate plans you have for like revision. So like, within the next 2 years, I'll be doing this, revising the project. So then in addition to kind of talking about your current project, this is also a space for you to talk about your future research trajectory. And you don't want to go like willy-nilly here. You want to say things that are sort of concrete and follow logically from what you're already doing. So maybe there are some aspects of the dissertation that you haven't been able to fit into the dissertation itself, but you could say I'm working on a cluster of articles that are related. Or if you have a second book project, that's another place for you to talk about it. It may seem like, when you're deep in the dissertation that you will like never have a second research idea, but, you will, because your dissertation is just kind of your first project of many, right? So this is a place for you to sort of begin fleshing out a little bit of the kind of trajectory you see for yourself. The committee wants to know that you're not sort of like a one-trick pony, right? That you have this project, but then also kind of other interests that grow out of and make sense, in relation to kind of what you're already interested in. Let's see. And so the kind of overall point of research statements are to sort of indicate that you will complete, your current project, and also be able to sort of envision others that are equally kind of exciting and innovative. They really sort of give a bigger picture of who you are as a scholar beyond just this dissertation and, like the one article you've written in grad school. And so then in terms of like just nuts and bolts like format, it's usually about 2 pages, single spaced. Usually you kind of will open with something like the main themes of your research, and kind of a little bit about like why they're important, and kind of what methodological approaches or skills you use to kind of address whatever question you're thinking about. Then you usually have kind of specific sort of examples of kind of, how you're thinking about these larger research questions in the dissertation, again, sort of fleshing out the dissertation, but also, again, connecting them to your kind of larger profile as a scholar. You can also include chapter summaries, or again, a discussion of the sort of immediate revisions in future years. Like, I have 4 chapters now and I'll be adding a chapter on X or something like that. And then a discussion of kind of your future research directions. And then you can also kind of close with like some mention of, where you've presented parts of this work, or, at conferences or publications if you have them, or if you've organized panels, kind of situating yourself a little bit within the kind of professional landscape. Yeah, so I think that's definitely not 10 minutes. I didn't time myself before this, but I know it's not that long. Okay, and then Lisa, you had also sent us a question about if I could tell myself one thing about job application materials. Should I do that now, or are we kind of doing that at the end, or like what?
If you have time to do it now, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, no, I feel like, sorry, this advice seems like so banal, but so, okay. I guess if I could tell myself one thing about job application materials, it would be that they benefit from being rewritten. So it's really hard actually to produce any of these documents for the first time. Like you don't know what you're doing the first time. And it's very, very helpful if you can see examples, but also just, having to write them and workshop them can seem really scary. But when I was on the market, this was sort of one of the most fruitful things for me, partially because it gave, like, if I don't know what kind of job support you have at the places you're at. But if you're able to like workshop documents with your peers, that's really, really helpful, partially because you get to see a lot of different sort of styles and versions of like how someone explains their project, right? And might give you ideas for things that you could do. But also for me, an added benefit was that it really helps you like maintain perspective on the market. And I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but you know, it's so easy to get like sort of either like overwhelmed in the numbers game, or like really, I don't know, maybe nobody's invested in the idea that it's like just a meritocracy anymore. But you know, it's like, it's very clear that everyone is doing like such exciting work, and so it's like really heartening to sort of read about it, but then also, you know, just like, I don't know, the reality of like the structural problem that it's like it's no one's fault, right? If you do like, you know, because the jobs are so scarce, but it's like sort of seeing that in a real concrete way, at least for me, was like very helpful in terms of just like staying grounded and not getting too sucked into kind of the sort of meritocracy lie. So yeah, I'm done.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. We're gonna hold for questions at the end, so please make a note of your questions. And we will move on to Daniel, who's gonna talk about the teaching statement.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Of course, this document's also available for you online. And if folks have questions about it, you want to email me afterward, feel free. So for a little bit of context, I don't think of myself this way, but maybe I'm the scary example when we were talking about job market. I was on the full-time job market 4 years when I got my job, though I started during my dissertation, right? Because I was eager. I saw stuff being listed, and, you know, I got some interviews that round, but anyway, I had also been teaching for 6 years. My university had fellowships, both sort of broad ones that you got when you applied, and then local ones you could get I went to Claremont Graduate, so with the 5 colleges, so I had one with Pomona and Harvey Mudd, but I also just started adjuncting early in my last year of coursework. I did a class at CSU San Marcos, then the next semester 2 classes at Fullerton. Then my partner and I moved up to the Bay, so I did an email blast to chairs of any department. I'm really interdisciplinary, so any department I could think of, and ended up landing some adjuncting gigs. So by the time it came to do the full job market package, I had been sort of marketing my teaching for a long time, and I'd accrued a lot of experience. So I'll go into sort of how this informed the selections when I get to the portfolio, but just, you know, that's some of the context. I also knew I wanted to end up at a CSU. My family's in the Bay Area. My book's on California because I wanted a job in California. I went to a CSU for undergrad, Sonoma State, and I liked the atmosphere, and at least the problems were familiar. So I sort of knew my target, though I applied really broadly, right? And I think there are many places I could be happy as an instructor, but it helped to have a sense of where I wanted to land, and the fact that I like research. You know, my research agenda is going well. I landed at a CSU with a lot of support for that, but I mean, teaching was really, it still is like a passion. So that was part of the journey that I had to understand how to translate that to other people. And I think as you think about your teaching philosophy or your teaching statement, really so much of it is about learning to understand yourself as a teacher. And I can't emphasize enough how much classroom time is important for that. Now, if you don't have an adjuncting gig or you don't have a teaching fellowship at your university, but you do tutoring, I would also think about that in the continuity of work that you're going to be doing. Because any university that you're applying to who's interested in your teaching skills is interested in the whole kind of range of them, right? So even if you're doing tutoring, that's applicable to, say, student advising or, you know, the ways that you think about kind of activities and that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll go into a little bit of how I thought about my teaching philosophy. So like the research statement, this is 2 pages. I really liked having a clean line between each paragraph. It wasn't always possible, and sometimes I played with the spacing on that, but I think it allowed the document to sort of each piece to stand on its own. As someone who's now been on the hiring side, these documents are mind-numbing from the other end, and it's not because the quality's bad, but it's because often the faculty who are reviewing them are already overburdened. before it comes to reviewing. Like we had a poetry job with 130 applicants. And, you know, the process was rewarding. We, of course, had more people than we could hire that we wanted to hire. But having some clean space in your documents, I think, is helpful for the eye and is helpful for making things pop. So I always start with a sort of global statement that markets some of the range of where I've taught at. I don't mention everywhere. I mention the places that are most applicable. This was for a CSU job. So I had 2 CSUs, the place I was teaching now and another place in the Bay Area who had a similar student population. I talked about having an active classroom approach because this is something I sort of learned by doing, that I liked having in-class activities, analysis activities, along with discussions. A piece of advice I got on my teaching philosophy that also really stuck with me is you want the people on the other side of the document to be able to imagine a day in your classroom, right? And from the level of how you hold an activity to how you structure a day to how that day fits into the longer trajectory of your teaching, the sort of narrative or build that you're trying to get students to achieve across the semester or building into your syllabus, as well as how these activities reach a range of different kind of learning styles. So I always say stages across a series of thematic clusters because that's the way my brain works. I teach a 15-unit semester and I got to break it up to digest it. And I think students tend to respond to that. I talk a lot about context because I was applying to an American Studies job and I do American Studies. Also, you'll notice the second paragraph is pretty much straight out of my diversity statement. This, I had like a 1.5 or 2-page diversity statement. This job had a 1-page supporting student statements. So there were elements of that that just migrated into my teaching philosophy because it's part of my teaching. I tried to mark my own positionality, the ways I've come to understand it in the classroom, how I can leverage it for students of similar experience, and also how I attempt to decenter it to broaden sort of the inclusivity of my classroom, the ways I think about text, the ways I think about what does success look like in the classroom. You know, if you can't say what success looks like for your students in the classroom, then I think you have some thinking to do. Because what you probably aren't doing is teaching inclusively if you aren't thinking about how various students can take different paths up the mountain, if that makes sense. I also try to emphasize the tools that I use to help my students achieve the outcomes I'm looking for, which aren't necessarily all the same thing, right? But a certain kind of engagement with text, a certain kind of thinking or analysis about text, context, and power. So that's sort of the bread and butter of American Studies, and I think environmental humanities as well. This is where I do my typical day in the classroom, 2 to 4 stages of work. I sketch them out, talk about how mixing activities helps equalize engagement between more talkative and reticent students. That's really important to bring in, especially at a university like San Jose State. The majority of our students are first generation in their family to go to college. So thinking about different ways of equalizing engagement, I mean, teaching in the CSU, it's a value of mine, but it also really matched the kind of place that I was trying to get a job at. Let's see, talk about if we're further along in the semester or if I'm working with advanced students, so like in a major class, I have a different way of prepping the classroom. You know, I might just give a quote from the text and have them respond to it. If I try that in a lower division GE class, it's not going to go the same way, right? So showing that you can think about different students' levels, the modes of engagement, GE versus major, that kind of thing is helpful. What else? Community engaged and experiential learning if you do it. And then here, a class that exemplifies my approach, I gave a class just an overview of a full semester. So this is how I structure my 3 units. This was a class that was particularly relevant to the environmental humanities, to California, so I used that. I had a paragraph like this for most any of the classes that I taught, and I swapped them out depending on the job. I would not use an Intro to Liberal Studies course for a Women's and Gender Studies job because I've been teaching in WGS for 6 years. I had other classes I could talk about. And then I always try to market student evals, things that go well, comments or pull quotes from a classroom evaluation. And I'll go into sort of student evals later because I know they're sort of tricky. But if you aren't getting observed wherever you're teaching, you can always request it. And generally, folks who are going to observe you are going to try to support you and give you feedback. They may give you different feedback in person than they put in the document as well. I mean, especially if they're trying to help cultivate you, they may just send you an email. You never know, but it's nice to have a copy of that you can put in your portfolio and to find some pull quotes that are relevant to the job. So effectively reach students, teach across various disciplines. That was important because I was applying for a job split across multiple departments. And then, just kind of a closing statement. As a prospective member, I look forward to blah, blah, blah. Continuing to expand my instructional repertoire, that sort of thing. 1 minute. Okay, cool. I'll just say the important thing for me for a teaching effectiveness portfolio is navigability. So it can be really labor intensive, but creating a table of contents with search terms, giving your own description of your class, of any classes you've taught, how many units it is, what department, what year, that kind of thing. And then I created a graph. I got this from the professors of my evals, and I scaled. One of them was on a 4-point scale. I scaled them all to 5 so that people can look across. I did an average across them. And this is selective. These are the classes that match the job and that also showed my strengths. There are some classes that didn't make it on here because they don't show my strengths. I think part of demonstrating your teaching, especially for those of us, so many of us have to learn by doing, is knowing where to bury the bodies, right? And people don't need to know about all the messy parts of your journey by looking at those documents. You can tell them about them by telling those folks about how you learned to teach better, how you responded when things weren't going well, that kind of thing. I guess the last part is a lot of people have anxiety about sharing student evals or observations. No one's going to read every little thing. They are not going to find the part where your student has a really sick burn about, I don't know, a comment you made about a particular text or something you keep saying when you're trying not to say, or saying a lot or whatever. So, don't take, obviously you want to be strategic, and the more you teach, the more materials you have to deploy and the more materials you can push off screen of your sort of bumps along the road. I think that's it. I'll stop there. And then if people have questions later.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel. All right, moving right along, we're going to hear from Rina on postdoc statements, the leadership statement, and research contribution statement.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thanks everybody for being in this space. I would just like to give a brief background about myself so that the context of why I found myself in a research fellowship this fall came about. So I'm originally from the Philippines, and I moved to Canada to do my PhD. So I'm in the interior and the traditional and currently occupied territories of the Silks Okanagan peoples, what is known as Kelowna. And when I moved here, I quickly realized that there is, and maybe it's the same in the United States, that there is lesser opportunities for international students, just like I am. So for example, all my funding opportunities during my PhD studies were basically like a Nobel laureate, right? Like 1,000 international students all applying for this thing, and there's just 2 of it, and they're very much high stakes. So I think that realization, and of course, tuition is quite different as well. We pay more. I think that realization made me kind of push for finishing my degree a little bit earlier than most people. I just finished my PhD last May. And another thing is that because I was so tired and just pushing and pushing and pushing, no matter what life events were happening during my time, and because I did not have the time to kind of wiggle through a lot of my degrees, like one thing after another, I couldn't afford really a break. I couldn't afford another year. I decided to apply to just 2 postdocs. And because I was not in the best state of mind, as we are when we're finishing up our dissertations, my decision to pursue a postdoc was important to where I see myself as a scholar. First, I wasn't sure if I want to already commit to a place, because a lot of the demands for us on the job market is that, oh, you have to move wherever the job is. And I, as somebody who's moved a country and who's still away from my family and finding the people that I want to be with here in BC and in Canada, I thought, I think I want to stay in Canada. I want to stay in British Columbia, and I want to try and stay here. And I think that played a big part into my decision to pursue a postdoc. I just don't want to regret anything 5 years down the road when you get the tenure and then suddenly, oh, I hate this job, I'm moving out. So again, I recognize that I'm quite lucky to say that, and that I was very, very fortunate in the 2 applications I've done for postdoc. So one was a national competition, very, very open to international students as well. So international applicants. So that was the only one I was allowed to apply for. And it was very competitive. I was very lucky that the second application happened, and then they informed me very early on. So I breathed a sigh of relief. So they told me December last year. So I think that's kind of the background there. And I'm going to share my screen now. So when it comes to a postdoc, which is really strange, the whole postdoc application process is quite strange, I find, because it's constantly needing to position yourself as the center of this novel research or whatever you're trying to do. So obviously, most of you know that there's, kinds of postdocs. So a postdoc that's research-based and a postdoc that's teaching-based. I kind of lucked out because I ended up with a research fellowship, and it's basically, I just do a project for the year, which is, I'm very lucky and I understand that. But, always in these kinds of documents, you have to center yourself. So I think the most practical advice I learned is to use active voice. Another thing that I've learned is, and you're going to see this here, here in Canada, the national competitions are very specific with their, I think, their formatting. So for example, leadership contributions only has to be 1 page, and that's all I have here. It's just 1 page, and then I adjusted the margins a bit. It's kind of seeing where the gray areas are, because if it says 1 page, but then it doesn't say anything about the margins, it doesn't say, oh, it has to be 2.5 inches. So I adjusted to like the maximum 2 inches just to have a little bit of that wiggle room. Any space matters. So when it comes to leadership contributions, this is always related to, just like what Rebecca was saying, it always goes back to the relevance to your research proposal. So I think it's also really hard for us, especially as academics, to not only position ourselves as the center of new and exciting research when we know that's not true. There's probably like 10 other people doing the same things as we are, who is just as amazing as we are, or even more. But I think what's really hard when you write these things is to choose which ones you really want to use as a proof that you can be a leader in your field, or if you don't have a lot, which happens as well, right? Not everybody has the same PhD or professional experience, what to put in there. But you know what, I realized that even the smallest things actually matter, and they can be included here. So for example, this is the most updated document I have, because I'm going to try again for the banting for the second year. And this is all related to the project that I made for this year. So I had to choose, for example, what would be really related to that project. So I always start with like a general statement of my own values and what I've been doing as a scholar and what I believe in as a scholar. And then I go straight to, I don't say a story. I go straight to the point. I think that's also important. As Daniel had said, these people, they're looking at thousands of documents in such a short amount of time. And us in the humanities. So one of my first mistakes when I applied for a national scholarship, and because my university does not have the supports in place yet at that time when I started out, is that I like to tell a story. I'm a creative writer, so I told a story about my life, and apparently they hate that. So as humanities students, I know that we love to tell stories and we love narratives, but usually when people are going through, 10,000 documents at one point, they just want you to go straight to the point. So that's as straight to the point as I could be. And then I just expand it to how is this particular experience, or how is this particular research, and I'll show you my research contributions later on, significant to the project proposal. Because usually in a project based postdoc, they want to see that. They want to see how you're going to lead, or how you're going to complete this research with the skills that you've learned and the skills that you've kind of showed in your other endeavors. So, and these depend on what you have. So I started with editorial activities because, a research project is always a writing project. Events administration, because part of the project is creating a symposium. And then leadership and scholarly organizations. And this is quite, I think, always exciting to them, that you're part, or you're willing to put yourself out there to be part of organizations. So that's how I chose. But again, this is really, really dependent on the project that you're proposing, or the position that you're proposing for as well. So make sure to read everything. That's another tip. And take time to read. Don't overwhelm yourself, because I found that as well for me. I kind of overwhelm myself with reading and looking through things. Yeah, thanks, Cassie. So this is research contributions. It's quite self-explanatory. Usually you start with your PhD thesis, or if you have a book already, which can happen, you can do that as well. So they include my MA thesis. And if you have anything published from your manuscripts, do that. So that's one thing that you do, as you can see, as clear as possible, and then what are my values and what are my strengths as a writer. So I'm going to answer the question here now that Lisa had posted. That's really quite a fun question, because it made me think of the time when I was so overwhelmed finishing a dissertation and just rushing to the end. My advice is actually quite similar to Rebecca's, wherein it's never to be too attached with your first draft. And it's so hard because I felt like my personal experience while finishing the dissertation was I was so exhausted, and I felt like this is it. I just want it to be this. I'm gonna stop sharing now. I just want to finish, and I want this draft to be the draft, but that's not true. Actually, try to pace yourself. I think that's the best thing. Make sure that you're aware of where you are and what your mental space is and how much energy you can devote to an application. And if you can't devote any energy to it, don't do it. That's my experience, because it's just a lot of noise and it takes away from where your energy should be. So it's a lot of work. So I'll just say that outright. It's a lot of work. But also when I was really, really overwhelmed, I was so lucky to reach out to senior scholars here in the Okanagan. So I reached out to my supervisor, and he talked me through what I should prioritize, because as Daniel said, like all the good things are popping up and you're like, oh, I can fit into there and I can apply for there. And I was feeling very, very overwhelmed. And then I also reached out to Astrida Neymanis, who was just new here, and we sat down and she talked me through, okay, what do you really want to do at this point? So if there's somebody helpful on your side and wants to chat with you, is willing to sit down with you, please reach out, and I'm sure they'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Rina. Moving on, Davy is going to discuss the diversity statement. And I just want to say a special thank you to Davy, who shared like, I don't know, 10 to 12 documents about diversity statements. So there is a wealth of resources in that folder, thanks to Davy.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa, for organizing this. Thanks, Cassie, for keeping us on time. Thanks, Rina and Daniel and Rebecca for sharing. I feel like I'm learning a ton, which is super helpful. I will give you a word of warning that there is a huge and very exciting thunderstorm happening currently where I am in Philadelphia. So if I suddenly disappear, that is why. The magic and challenge in Zoom. 2 words about me so that you know where my work is coming from. I live in Philadelphia on unceded Lenape land, and I'm a postdoc at Princeton in architecture, which is kind of a head scratcher because my PhD is in English, something I'm happy to talk about later if that's applying for interdisciplinary postdocs, that's helpful. But I'm going to talk about the diversity statement. I'm going to put a link in the chat, which is a link to a Google Doc, just with some access notes of what I'm going to talk about. And to say a word about the documents that Lisa mentioned, I was really stressed and nervous about writing a diversity statement, actually revising one in 2020, the second time I went on the market. And so I just looked around for what universities' career services offices have put together, some instructions, what do people think this thing is? And I just found a bunch of different institutions that had a public document of, okay, graduate students, here's how to write a diversity statement. And I put them in a folder. And anytime anyone around me has said the words diversity statement or expressed a look of stress, I've just sent them this folder of stuff because I found these things really helpful. And because the diversity statement is a relatively new part of the application process. And so folks have a lot of ideas about what it is. I'll tell you a little bit about how I think about it. And I will just stress that this is one way of thinking about this document. There are a lot of ways to think about it. So the way that I conceptualize the diversity statement is as a document that helps a search committee understand the way you think about power and inequality in your teaching service and research. Understanding that by virtue of working in a university system, we're working in the context of racial capitalism. The students in our class have different relationships to structural privilege that make the classroom a more or less accessible space to them. And your job in the diversity statement is to say, okay, I work in an equitable system. Here is what I do to advance the pursuit of justice in my teaching service and research. Here's what that looks like. And something else the diversity statement is helpful for is showing stuff about your work that's really important to you that might not appear in these other documents. So if you have a really cool collaborative project, there's something you do in your work, you have a relationship, you have a close relationship with someone in the student advising office who's been really helpful to you in your capacity to support students, the diversity statement is a way to talk about how you build relationships within and outside the institution also. Because something that, to answer, Lisa, your question about something you could have told yourself at the beginning of your job market process is that I didn't think about the job market process as needing to show my work as both individual and collaborative. There's so much of a narrative of this is about you and your teaching and your research. But a department is hiring a colleague. They're hiring someone to collaborate with. They're hiring someone to talk to when their student is having a hard time. And the diversity statement is a really good place in your application materials to talk about what you're like as a collaborator and the way that you think about collaboration coming from a field that is often more oriented to individual work and individual kind of false myth of individual participation than a lot of other fields. So some other things about the diversity statement, there is, in my opinion, and I'm super curious as to what other folks think, and I'd love to know in the Q&A, there's no specific expectation of how much is meant to talk about research, about teaching, and about service. And so if you have examples from your service work, you've been on a committee, you have done a collaborative project, and you really want to lead with that, and that gives a really clear sense of how you think about power in your work, that's a great thing to start with. So some examples, this is the bottom of page 1 in this document of notes. If you've worked with first generation and low income students and you're applying to an institution that serves a large population of first generation and low income students, that's a good thing to think about. And generally this is building on something, Daniel, that you were saying, that the diversity statement, like the teaching statement, is a way to talk about the fact that you know what this institution is looking for. You know where it's located, you know what its needs are. you've gotten a good sense of not only that this institution is looking for a qualified and energetic scholar, but also a person who's going to meet their students' needs. And so if you do a lot of collaborative work and they're running an EH search and looking for someone to do collaboration with a center or a program or another department, and you can offer examples that show that, that's a helpful thing to do. Just on the second page, going through some of the questions that Lisa, you asked, I think of diversity statements as being between 1 to 3 single space pages, but 2 is a pretty good number to aim for. And yet, as Daniel was saying about an application that they applied for, if they say 1 page, send them 1 page. If your statement is 2 pages, cut it down so that the institution, the department is getting what they asked for. I find it helpful for the content to be pretty anecdotal. So just as Daniel, what you were saying about being able to see a day in your classroom, I think being able to picture you as a collaborator, to be able to hear what's happening in a workshop that you designed is really, really helpful, especially because some of the stuff that falls out of the frame of here's what my research is, here's what my teaching is, you do a lot of other stuff in your work. And sometimes it's hard to make that stuff evident to someone reading your application materials. And if you can make some of that stuff evident, if you've organized workshops as part of a Center for Teaching and Learning, if you've organized professional development workshops for ASLE, those are the kinds of things that it's really helpful to be able to describe not only I did this thing, but here's why I did it, here's how I did it, here's the kind of space that I hope it made when I did it. Things to avoid. I realized going back through the diversity statement that I used last year with some sort of modular switching in and out of paragraphs that I shied away from using the word diversity because I feel like that's a word that means a lot of different things to different people. And I wanted to be able to highlight the way that I think about power in my work. And I felt like the word diversity was kind of a barrier to that. And so I titled the statement, whatever the institution wanted it to be called, but I talked more about things that mattered to me in my work, supporting queer and trans students, building community partnerships, making my classroom accessible. I talked about the things that matter to me when I think about power in my work. I think if you feel like I don't know what to say about diversity, don't say anything about diversity. Think about the kind of colleague that you are and the way that you show up for people and the way that you aspire to understand systems of inequality and write against them in your research. And that's what they need to know. Some other examples of kinds of stuff that you might not think could show up in your application materials, but would be really helpful in a diversity statement. If you've had students who have had a hard time and you have reached out to a center at your institution, to a colleague, to a student support organization, the diversity statement is not a place to disclose what was going on with your student, but just to say, I had a student who was struggling and I collaborated with folks in student services to figure out how to use the resources of the institution to get that student what they needed. Again, showing yourself as a collaborator. If sort of a general thought, we all do this kind of improbable form of work because we deeply care about it. And the diversity statement is a place to make that care palpable to others in ways that exceed your other materials. And so as you're thinking about what that thing is, here's what I would do if I were writing a diversity statement for the first time. I'd think about the question, and these are notes in the 3rd page of this document. What are the topics or approaches that are integral to how I address power, justice, and inequality in my work? And I'd take some time to write them down. I would then ask, what are some examples that illustrate the approaches that are most representative of how I do this? So what's the stuff that matters to me and where in my work am I doing this and where am I most excited about it? So you might think about things that you've told non-academic people in your life about, that if your friend has said, what are you doing at work? And you've said, well, I organized this workshop and I was so excited about it because this conversation happened, or here's this moment in class that I was really excited about. Those are good moments to talk about in your diversity statement. You might come up with a paragraph or two of each of those things, how you think about power, justice, and inequality in your teaching, research, and service, or in a different order, depending on the nature of the institution you're applying to. Write a couple of paragraphs about each of them and start condensing and putting them together just to give yourself something to work with if you're thinking about, well, what is this thing that is a diversity statement? And also in that document, in that set of documents in the Google Drive folder, is the statement I used last year. And I basically did what I've been describing here, and understood that I couldn't talk about every concept related to questions of diversity all at once. And so I picked some stuff that mattered to me. Something that I've done a lot of that I really like doing is curricular design. So in addition to some of the stuff that I mentioned, I thought about myself not only as a teacher, but as a person doing curricular development work. And so you might also think about other stuff that matters to you that you want to make sure comes across, and flesh that out in your diversity statement. In my remaining minute, one other thing I never thought about on the job market until I did, is that people who are running a search are really excited and that you are excited and nervous, you are applying for jobs, but that people who are running a search are trying to find a new person that they might work with for 30 years or 2 years, which is still a long time. But hiring a new colleague is a big deal. You're welcoming a person into your life. Think about friends you made in grad school. Someone made an administrative decision that put the two of you in the same room. And thinking about people on a hiring committee as being excited and passionate, as well as scary and assessing me, I think made the process feel a little more like it's some of its possible friendliness balanced out its absolute terrifyingness. So I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Really helpful information from all the presenters. And last but not least, really excited to hear from Cassie about application materials for community college jobs.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to be fairly brief on this because it's just a few notes I wanted to give in terms of how to approach community college positions in comparison to small liberal arts college or research like R1 institutions, because this was something that I did not know and I did not really think a whole lot about going into the process. To be honest, I didn't really know that I should be differentiating between these types of institutions. So it wasn't until I started getting interviews that my advisor was like, oh, wait, no, we need to think about this differently. So I'm just going to start with I actually decided I am going to share my screen. So if anything goes wrong, just let me know. I think I'm sharing my desktop so that you can see a comparison of the way I ordered my CV for my standard CV for a Slack or R1 job is on the left, and then the way that I ordered for a community college is on the right-hand side. And so I think the big difference is, community colleges, from my experience, seem to be more interested in the teaching side of things, less interested in the research. And so, you'll see I start with my educational background and my publications for the R1 and Slack jobs, but then I privilege the academic appointments and the types of courses that I've taught in the community college, and the publications come later along with presentations. Another thing that might be helpful depending on the position would be moving the service section up as well. But I just wanted to share that sort of comparison because that was a big shift in the way I thought about things. And the same goes for that cover letter. In my initial, in my applications to community colleges, I talked a lot less about my research and talked a lot more about my teaching, and then made sure that the teaching portion came first and I was really positioning myself as a teacher of students with many different career goals, right? Because a lot of the questions that I got in interviews were about, okay, so maybe some of your students want to go on to a four-year institution. Some of them may want to go into trade school. Some of them may want to get their associate's degree and be done with school. How can you serve all of these different students with all these different career goals in this position? And so trying to emphasize that breadth of ability to mentor students for all different types of goals was important to include in that cover letter. And it was a question that came up I interviewed for 2 community college jobs, and definitely a question that came up for both. The other thing I wanted to touch on, the big thing I wanted to touch on, is the different process after, if you have been selected to move forward in the selection process. This was something that even the folks advising me didn't know about until after I started interviewing for these jobs. So typically for an R1 institution, and if anyone else has a conflicting narrative, let me know, but at an R1 institution or a small liberal arts college or any academic tenure track position that's not at a community college, the procedure is, you submit your application. If they didn't ask for lots of materials at the beginning, they may, winnow down their list a little bit, ask for more information like letters of recommendation, sample syllabi, things like that. Then they'll winnow down their list a bit more, and then you may get invited for a first interview. From my experience, that first interview for R1 and Slack tended to be on Zoom or a like platform. And then if you make it past that round, which I did not for any of those jobs, you will be invited for a campus visit. It's very different with the community college process from what I learned and had to sort of like learn as I went. So both of the positions that I interviewed for at community colleges the plan was for 2 rounds of interviews. So one of them, that first round interview was on Zoom. And the focus was very much on, teaching in the community college population. And then the second community college that I interviewed with, they had me come in person for that first interview. And I remember being very surprised. I thought I was getting scammed when I got the invite, because it was like very formulaic, not personal at all, and was like HR text. And it specifically said that we will not reimburse you for any of your travel costs for this first interview. So my first thought was, oh my gosh, it's just a scam. So I sent it off to some professors. They all talked to each other, found a professor in the department who taught at a community college, and it happened to be the community college I was applying for. And they were like, actually, that's pretty typical for community jobs. Like, it's not unusual for a community college to, if they're hiring for a tenure track position, to require you to come in person for that first interview and to not pay for that first interview. I was lucky enough that my university that I'm getting my doctorate at allowed me to use my travel funding. So that's always something worth investigating. If you would have to travel for that interview, see if you can use, conference funds or other travel funds from your home institution to go and can do that interview. I did make it past that interview, and they had me do a teaching demo as well at the beginning of that. That seems to be another big difference between R1 institutions and Slack institutions and then community colleges, is that rather than a job talk where you would center that talk largely on your very specific research, for a community college position, the 2 that I interviewed for, they wanted a teaching demo instead. And it tends to be a lot shorter than a job talk. So I was asked for both positions to do a 15-minute teaching demo. And I think for that, it's important to highlight, at least for the positions I was looking at, which were in English departments and or in women's gender and sexuality studies departments. One of them was a very interdisciplinary position. They wanted to see how I could teach about the humanities while also showcasing how I could teach writing specifically. And so that was something new that I had to think about, like, how do I pick what material I want to teach, and how do I balance, my ways of bringing lessons about systems of power and equity with my teaching of writing skills in these teaching demos. So that was another big difference. that is kind of the gist of like the big things I discovered in the process. I was kind of the guinea pig of my department. No one had really done the community college interviews before. So now we have a bunch of resources and I'm a little bit better prepared going forward. The other thing I'll say is I did not really get asked at all about my research in those community college positions. That doesn't mean that my research wouldn't be supported, however. I do know from hearing from folks who worked at Portland Community College was one of the places I interviewed at. That was a community college, and they are very supportive of their faculty's research agendas. And then the final thing I'll say, I want to leave with like a piece of hope in this stressful time of applying for jobs is that when I interviewed at Palomar College in California, the faculty members were very adamant in stressing that they felt like they were actually able to, through this position, through their job as tenure track faculty in the English department there, they actually were able to achieve a work-life balance that they hadn't experienced at other institutions, at R1 or SLAC institutions. And so that was a really sort of interesting and like hopeful thing to hear, right? That that might be a really huge trade-off for, maybe having less time for your research, but having more work-life balance could be a big payoff when you're thinking about what types of institutions you may choose. And I'm sure that varies, I have a sample size of 2 schools, so that's not a huge sample size, but I just wanted to share that little piece of information because it was refreshing to hear people say that they could, go home at night and turn off their computer and relax with their family, which is not something you hear a ton in our profession. So I will leave it at that. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cassie. And thank you again to all of the presenters. Really appreciate the time that you've taken with us and the materials that you've shared. We're going to move into the Q&A portion. We have a little less than 30 minutes, so hopefully y'all have lots of questions. But I do want to just start with the question about the cover letter, since we haven't talked about that at all. And so I want to open it up to whichever of our presenters would like to talk about, the most important thing that they learned about writing a cover letter. And anyone who maybe, Daniel talked a bit about being on a hiring committee. So, what kinds of things do hiring committees really look for? And then please, feel free to put questions in the chat, other questions in the chat that you want to ask about, and we'll go in order of the questions that they appear. But then also feel free to raise your hand if you already have a question queued up to go, and then we'll move right to that after we talk about cover letters for a bit. So whoever, Daniel, you want to go first? Thanks.
Sure. I don't have very much to say about cover letters, but I figure on the teaching, I would say to follow up on what Cassie was saying about how to arrange your CV. If you're looking at a teaching university, that holds as well, where you want to put teaching first. And it also holds with the cover letter, where you probably want to put, intro/match paragraph, and then teaching, and then research. And you may, I guess the other thing I'd say is, I was saying in the teaching statement how you want to have little paragraphs that give a sense of what your class looks like in the broadest scope. Like, these are the texts I'm using, this is the outcome. Eventually, I was at it for some years, but eventually you have like those different classes locked. And so you'll think about, which class am I going to model in my cover letter? Which class am I going to model in my teaching statement? Especially if you're trying to show breadth. A lot of us in environmental humanities are wearing multiple hats. And the last thing I'd say, other than my land acknowledgement, which I forgot, which is that SJSU is on Ohlone Coast-Minoan land. I'm in El Sobrante, northern in the Bay, and Ohlone Huichin land. The other thing I'd say is that make sure you're putting recognizable texts in there. That's something I got a lot, especially I was teaching in WGS and then applying for English jobs. And one of my mentors kept being like, they're not going to know who any of these fucking people are. Like, make sure you've got sometimes older scholars. That's why you see Fordlandia. I taught it and the unit went well, but also that's why you see that, say, in my intro to liberal studies. Or I love to teacher, always put like Audrey, like greatest hits. Think about who from your text, add one or two things maybe if you think they're hot and someone's going to know it. But otherwise, stick to the text and authors that your reader is going to know. That way you're building those bridges right away.
Thanks, Daniel. Any of our other presenters want to share your thoughts on cover letters? Davy?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say two quick things. One, make sure that the way that you describe your research is available to a non-specialist. I applied for jobs where there was a medievalist, a compositionist, a person who teaches English education who did not know they were hiring an environmental literature person because they didn't have one. And there might be specialists who work on exactly what you work on, but there also might be folks who are interested in your project, especially if you're applying to an interdisciplinary job, but really don't work in your field. And so you might try reading the paragraphs about your research to a non-academic in your life. I read them to my dad, and my dad is a person who did an undergraduate degree and no additional education. He does not know how universities work. He does not know what I work on. And every time he was confused, I knew that I needed to say something in more straightforward terms. And so you might find a willing non-academic in your life to listen to you, or a person in a very different field. If you have a biologist or a neuroscientist in your life, you might talk to that person. So that I was really nervous about sounding like an expert. And as a result, I was just really unclear in many, many, many early drafts of my cover letter. So think about non-specialists and really clear versions of your work. And if it's possible to talk about a class that you would teach at that institution, if the job ad says the person in this position will teach the introduction to the English major, if you can say, well, I've just, as Daniel was saying, I've taught, when I teach X class, I do X and Y, I teach Audre Lorde, here's how I do it. I do this activity. In the introduction to the English major at this institution, I would do these things. It's helpful for them to get a sense that you have a sense of what's going on at the institution. When I applied for a job at a school that the English department mostly trains future high school English teachers, they're mostly double majors in education. I talked about wanting to work with future teachers as much as you can draw connections between your background and what actually happens in that department. They'll know that you want to work there and understand what the deal is with that department. And that's a helpful thing too.
I'll just add, you can often find those syllabi for the classes that Davy's talking about online if you Google them, and then you don't want to replicate it, but it can give you a sense of the sort of norms.
Great, Rina?
I'm just going to add really quickly, I suddenly remembered I was on a hiring committee for a Canada Research Chair search here in my university a couple of years ago. And my experience, so I'm just going to filter through my experience. I really hate making cover letters. I just hate it. It's just not my thing. I'd rather write the research proposal than the cover letter, because I feel like the cover letter just is regurgitating the same things that you already have in 5 other different documents. But it is a very important thing because that's the first thing they will open, right? So my guide to creating cover letter, aside from the initial introduction of who I am, my research interests, is really to respond to the job ad. The job ads are, from my very limited experience, they tell you what they want. And if there are some parts that are kind of confusing, I sometimes talk to, again, a friend, a colleague, a senior scholar. I work through my community a lot. I work with my community a lot. And I ask them, what do you think are they asking for? Do you think I fit in here? And that's when I pivot to when I was in the hiring committee. I realized that often some people will try to make themselves fit in a particular position, and because the academic job market is hard, and I think, like, in a cover letter, you want to be straightforward in how you are the perfect person or a possible candidate for that particular job, and respond to as much as what they're asking for in the job ad, and what you think, as you've done your research, which is also important, do your research, in the institution, as other people have mentioned. Make sure that this is where you want to be, that you can do great things here. If you know somebody within that institution who have worked there, talk to them as well. It's a lot of work, but I feel like that will shape your cover letter better because you're responding to what they're asking for. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rina. Cassie, I know you had your hand up and then you put it down. Did you want to add something? And then Rebecca, will go to you.
Yeah, I'll just add a small piece just because it's something I had no idea was something that would be expected of me. Because if you're finishing your degree and you're finishing your dissertation while you're doing this, it's almost impossible to get yourself to think about future book projects, but it is really important to, and I know this was touched on earlier in the workshop, but to think about and create a idea for a second book project to talk about in that cover letter. And the thing my advisor constantly told me, because I was like, what if I say this and then that's not what I end up writing about? No one will hold you to exactly what you say in your cover letter at all. No one will remember what was in your cover letter at all. So that was something that caught me off guard, and I had to really think, okay, beyond this dissertation, can I do anything else? And then figure out what it was I was interested in and basically make up a whole new book project that I may or may not get to write someday.
Thanks, Cassie. Rebecca?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess at this point, I feel like everything I'm going to say is just redundant. I'm just going to underscore some things that everyone else has already said because it was great advice. Building up what Danielle said, it's actually very useful often to have sort of two actually separate versions of your cover letter, like one that you use and edit for your R1 and Slack institutions, and then one that you kind of edit and use as your template for the teaching ones. So I've applied to a wide range of schools, and so the teaching ones, you do still need to talk about research in the kind of cover letters for your teaching cover letters, but you want to have it kind of later after you do all the things that we've talked about, like demonstrate your kind of teaching values and the things that you kind of are really making up the core of your sort of classroom persona and the way that you kind of structure your classes and think about your interactions with students. And almost nobody on your committee is actually going to be a specialist in your field. What Davy said is totally true. You need to, you want to sort of pitch your cover letter to a smart undergraduate, someone who's intelligent, but actually is not at all a specialist in your field. The way, you actually need to explain a lot, because nobody, even your dissertation committee, right, doesn't know your project like you do, even if maybe they are area specialists, but the committee reading your work definitely doesn't know, they may not be close to your field. They may be a random assortment of people. So if you pitch it, not just to the level of a smart undergraduate, but kind of with that sense of actually needing to lay out clearly, and almost have a little, even in the cover letter, a little bit of a teaching vibe, this project does X things, it's, really innovative in this way. The more you can kind of highlight that, and I mean, I know it's kind of hard to assume all these kind of grandiose postures, but you do kind of have to do that a little bit. So yeah, so I guess I just wanted to say that actually having two separate versions of your cover letter can be really useful, and then the kind of pitch it to a smart undergrad, and then I guess Rina said the other thing I was going to say, which was the more you can tailor the cover letter to the call that they're looking for, the better, because the committee wants to know that they're looking for someone who sort of will cater to their interests to some extent. So but yeah, so I think that's it.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot to the questions in the chat. Cassie, would you mind reading aloud Leah Becker's? Thanks.
Absolutely. So thank you for sending this, Leah. So the two questions Leah put forth are: how much space should be dedicated to defining research terms in the cover letter, if any? For example, I work on eco-consumption, eco-consumerism, and I am not sure how important it is to define this for a non-environmental humanities audience. And then the second question, I've heard that it's important not to reuse specific language from one job document to another, cover letter versus research statement versus teaching statement. Is that true? And if so, how do you avoid it? Thanks for those great questions, Leah.
Go for it, Rebecca.
Yeah, I guess I can get us started. Thanks, Leah, for those questions. My initial sense in response to your first question, I guess kind of goes back to what I was just saying. So, I mean, I know a little bit about your work actually, but like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily know or remember like what eco-consumption is or eco-consumerism. So I would like, if you have a term or an idea that's like particularly central to your project, I think you definitely like go into pedagogical mode. Like you need to, you know, explain it a little bit for your reader. You don't need to have like a whole paragraph, but you can have like a phrase or a sentence of gloss that, because otherwise, if that term is like central to your work and your reader doesn't know what it is, they're not going to be able to follow like the rest of the kind of, you know, kind of interventions or importance that that term takes in the rest of the project. And then for the second question, I had also received that advice, and it's definitely hard because it does seem like a lot of the materials are just like repeating a lot of the same things, like Rina was just saying. And I think a lot of it is almost like, don't be afraid of being repetitive, but you don't want to repeat the exact same thing. So like, even if people like they read the cover letter, but then by the time they get to the research statement, like they forgot all the details. And especially if there's like one or two lines that you really think are crucial in the cover letter, like you could take them and put them in the research statement and then like expand on them. So like, for example, I don't know, I have this cover letter where I say like, these cultural responses to failure yield like a complex account of state protection. And then like I took that sentence from like my cover letter and I put it in the research statement, and then I just like expanded on what that looked like. Like you can definitely repeat key ideas, but you know, like you won't have like different documents will give you different levels of like room to like play around with in terms of like how modular or how general or specific you are in terms of like unpacking what that is. So I guess I wouldn't be afraid to be repetitive as long as you're kind of, you know, kind of modulating kind of like what those kind of core repeated ideas are if you decide you need to repeat them.
Anyone else have any thoughts about that question? Well,
I agree with Rebecca, yeah.
If you think of anything, you know, please feel free to put it in the chat. I will move on to the next question in the chat then. When, if you applied to departments in different disciplines, did you have different teaching / research statements for different disciplines? And I would ask, actually, did you have different cover letters too? Or did you have parts in each document that could be switched out depending on the discipline? Thanks for that question. Cassie?
Yeah, so I think, well, I know, Lisa, you applied to stuff across disciplines a lot more than I did. A large chunk of mine were for English departments. However, when I did apply, you know, to things sort of like outside of English, I definitely had, you know, a different cover letter, different research statement. Well, the research statement and the diversity statement were the two that stayed the closest across all of my materials for different jobs, because those I felt like, you know, my research, the way that I describe my research might be slightly different, kind of based on what we talked about with the cover letter and defining terms and how specialized the language is that I use. But in terms of what I'm saying about my research, that stays about the same. And then the diversity statement would stay very close to the same. The teaching statement definitely evolves for me based on, you know, what classes the advertisement thinks or says I might be teaching, or if it doesn't say, I'll go into the department's webpage and look for classes that are offered that I might be interested in teaching, in addition to proposing some courses. The place where I really feel like you can differentiate across different disciplines is like it's good to have a class or two that you think you could add to the department that they don't currently offer. And you can specialize those classes, come up with a cool, catchy title, depending on what type of department. So like what class I'm imagining teaching a class on, I think I call it like discourses of disease, and, popular iterations of these discourses in media today. And that would be something that I could propose for a more general environmental humanities position, whereas like the class I'd love to teach on Cold War Black women's literature would be something I might propose in a job for an English department. So it totally depends on the document and on the job, but I do think that the research statement and the diversity statement changed the least for me across disciplines.
Davy?
Just to echo some of what Cassie was saying, I had I work at the intersection of queer and trans studies and EH and urban studies. And so I had a gender studies set of materials and I had an EH set of materials, and they almost didn't overlap at all. I described pretty much everything totally differently. And the thing that I will say about that didn't occur to me initially, that I had some coaching and help with, and I had something that I would recommend if there is someone in your life, in your academic life, who can read your materials, who is in the field that you're applying in, who is not in an English department. I found that very helpful, because the thing that changed the most was how I talked about the stakes of the literary in my work, that I realized that I was still talking too much about being a literature scholar applying to gender studies jobs, where really what mattered is that my project has stakes that are relevant to queer and trans theory, where they happen to make those arguments in literary studies, but like in one search that I participated in, there were 2 political scientists and a sociologist in the committee, and they don't care that I'm coming from an English department. They actually think it might be kind of questionable if they're mostly interviewing social scientists. And so in applying to different disciplines, the thing that I changed the most was, what does it mean that I work on literature, where showing that I could teach close reading really mattered applying to an English department, whereas showing that I could use a literary archive to make arguments relevant to an interdisciplinary conversation, in my case, gender studies, is a really different kind of methodological spin on my work. And that's what I ended up changing the most, just because in an English department, one cares about something really different. And I got that wrong for a long time before someone pointed it out to me. And so.
Great, thank you. I would just add, as someone coming from an environmental studies department, so I'm not in an English department, and what I was finding that I was really needing to do, I got feedback on this, was I needed to frame myself as a literary scholar for English department jobs, because coming from environmental studies, I wasn't really thinking about that in my way. So it's really about, what I plan to apply, this round on the job market is thinking like, okay, what is really tailoring it to the specific job? Not like losing sight of like who I think of myself as a scholar, but I think of myself as an environmental studies scholar, but I do literary scholarship, and so I'm not losing myself by articulating myself as a literary scholar, and that I need to just say that very specifically, especially because my PhD is not in English. So I need to say in my research statement, in my cover letter, I am a literary scholar. So that's an example for anyone who's not coming from an English department who might be applying for English jobs. And I think, that might apply to whatever department that you might be applying in. I don't see any other questions. Daniel, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just kind of on that note, I think for a lot of us interdisciplinary folks, English is actually the hardest audience to pitch to, because they're going to ask you to tell them how you'll teach a survey. And you need to tell them people so like, that being said, if you're going to teach modernism, you can use Nella Larson, right? And that's still a bridge. But I think if you're not interested in teaching those classes, then don't apply to the jobs. If you're going to put yourself through the labor of applying to those jobs, think about how you're going to wear that suit, right? And who you would choose to teach in your, say, 20th century survey without, like, I don't know, feeling like you've abandoned all of your research interests to do so. And it can be really hard, but I think actually sketching out a 10 or 15 week class and the books that you might teach and poems you might teach, I think just having that on a post-it somewhere in case the English job calls you up for an interview is a really good mental exercise. And if you can't get there, then maybe put your energy elsewhere.
Great, thank you. I wanted to, we just have a few minutes left, and I feel like I would like to hear more about postdoc materials specifically. I'm sure many of you have also applied to postdocs. Davy, you're in a postdoc right now as well. And so I'm wondering if there's anything you would add to what Rina, talked about her statements, but also cover letter for postdocs, research statement for postdocs, teaching statements. What was different? What did you do differently? What would you recommend?
I'm happy to jump in on that for a second, and just to say that so I'm in an interdisciplinary postdoc that is architecture, urbanism, and the humanities. If you're applying to an interdisciplinary postdoc and you have interlocutors in other fields, talk about that in your materials. If you're regularly in conversation with folks in an environmental studies program or geographers, or you have a person if you're in an English department, outside of an English department on your committee, show that you can have interdisciplinary conversations. That seems to super matter. Also, look at what the postdocs did in their postdoc, and if it's normal in my postdoc for someone to run a lecture series, figure out what postdocs do in that particular program and talk about how excited you'd be to do that thing, because that seems to vary quite a bit from postdoc to postdoc. And just as you want to know what the needs of an institution are when you apply for a faculty role, knowing what the activities of the postdoc are, whether you're going to be in a seminar twice a week or whether they're going to have you do your research and never be in conversation with anyone. My postdoc is super hands-on, but lots of others aren't. Understand whether or not the postdoc wants you to teach, and if they do, talk about your teaching. But yeah, I think just because postdocs can be so different from one another, look at what folks are up to and figure out how to communicate that you'd be excited to participate in whatever those activities are.
Great, thank you. Any other comments about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly add that just to echo what Davy was saying, it's so true in my experience in our field in particular, or specifically in the environmental humanities. People are so generous with their, look at Davy, right? Just gave us so much materials and gave us a beautiful document for a diversity statement. But that's been generally my experience. And I find that a lot of my colleagues here in Canada or in the US are so willing to sit down for a Zoom conversation, to chat with you, to look at your materials, to devote their time and effort, because I feel personally that they all want you to succeed just as they have. And that sense of community is something that I really enjoy in our field. So I think another thing there is, don't be afraid to ask. And of course, some people will say no, right? Depending on their energy and the commitment that they can give. But the more people you can circulate your document to, aside from, for example, in a postdoc, the supervisor you want to work with, it's really better. So another point, like what Davy was saying, when I was doing the research proposal for this particular fellowship that I'm incoming for, which I included as well in the documents that's to be shared. I showed it to as much people as I could. I even showed it to my partner, and he's not a literary scholar or not even in the, he's a mechanic. So just that perspective, and to say like, oh yeah, I get it, and that's really important. And it allowed me to think through, because sometimes there's also the requirement for a lay abstract. So it's a general, you write an abstract of your project for the general audience. So it allowed me to think through that. So yeah, it's really dependent on the postdoc or the position you're applying for, but always reach out to people around you. And more often than not, I find that people in our field are so willing to help and to chat with you and to help you succeed.
Thanks, Rina. And we're at 6:30 Pacific time. So thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you to our participants. I just put in the chat a link to the ASLE grad students Facebook page. That's where we'll be announcing the October workshop, which will be on academic adjacent and alternative alternatives to academic jobs. So join us then. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening all.